So all the way from Los Angeles, California, María.
Thank you so much for being here. I don't know most of you, but I really appreciate that you came. Carlos and the museum have been a great mentor to my work. I'm one of those obscure artists, like a blip on the radar, you know, and my work has been very political. So it isn't entertainment per se, and I live in Hollywood, so you know that's going to be tough. So every time I made a piece, somebody would offer me a film or some opportunity to do stuff, and I kept having to turn it down because it was junk. And my mother did not send me to music school for me to be in some movie where I have to bend over and a kid shoots me in the butt with an arrow and that's my cameo. I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be in Chuck and Buck. Sounds like a nasty movie, but no. I don't want to be in the Madonna video for Evita. I don't even like Evita, okay, but it's the attitude of the industry that's very difficult to engage with for me. So some of my friends think I'm downwardly mobile. And I'm okay with that. The museum, by giving these awards or by recognizing our work, especially for somebody like me who's a working class musician and has a straight job most of the time, because my husband, as fabulous as he is, he can't cut the mustard all the time with the money. So I've had to make my living in translation and interpreting, which I love very much. So at some time, you see your painter friends, the ones who make a living, and I get envy. I'm like, damn, look at them. They can live, sell their work, and what am I going to do? Sit on that corner and play a song and put on my hat, So, but then I began to realize that the work I did, like in the last 10 years, I opened up the field of medical interpreting in hospitals, in the public hospitals in L.A. County. This cello has played at every public hospital in L.A. County. Martin Luther King, East Harvard, East L.A., Rancho Los Amigos, L.A. County General Hospital, and all of you, UCLA in the Valley. In many, many of the clinics. This cello has played for people who were on the moment of passing, they're about to die. This cello is, and I don't say this to most audiences, this is from the late 1700s. So this cello has had many lives. And I feel so honored to be its keeper. And I told a friend of mine that I'm so lucky I get to care for this cello in this life. She started laughing. She says, you think you're caring for the cello? She says, the cello's caring for you. There it is. So I've had this instrument since I was 15, and I'm very fortunate to have it. My mother had to take on extra teaching jobs so that I could have a good instrument, be in all those competitions and things that happen in classical music. And then it turns out my life took a left turn, literally a left turn, and I became very active with the Farm Workers Union. So I began to work with Dolores Huerta, with Caesar, and did a lot of work in that area. And then the union unfortunately took a position against undocumented workers, and I left the union and began to work for the rights of undocumented immigrants, and that's been a lot of my work. So I do culture, language, and music, and politics. I don't know what it is. It's just a bunch of stuff. Only the museum would give an award to a person like me if you ask. But I'm very, very grateful. I haven't been a writer until now. The first time Carlos invited me, I did a piece called Chola con Cello. And it was a piece about immigrant, undocumented human rights. It was a piece about racism. I did another piece later called The Adventures of Connie Chancla. Boy, that Chancla piece had a run. It went all over the country. People loved that piece. And it was about indigenous women's history on both sides of the border. And then I was fascinated by the African diaspora in Mexico, just really have a great love for that idea. And of course the museum was one of the first places that actually looked at the African diaspora in Mexico. Other places are still, hiding the black people, It's like, there's such beauty in that connection. So I feel very fortunate. And I've been able to work with some, Dr. Toni Humber, who's a scholar in LA, and she helped me to do my work, and then by helping me, she got turned down, and she went off on her own to do her own work on the African diaspora in Mexico. So, as artists, we feed each other, we inspire each other. And there's things we steal from each other también, pero we won't talk about that. Okay. About 2 years ago, I had injured my back and I was home, and a friend called, an academic friend, said, Elena, your life is on pre-sale on Amazon in a book. I said, what? And then I found out that somebody who had interviewed me like 25 years ago, a Chicano academic, had decided to publish a book about me without my permission, without my review, without any. It was incredibly unethical. And on top of it, it was badly translated, because I go back and forth between English and Spanish, and his wife, who's not a native speaker, had translated it. And I'm a translator. How can I have a book about me that's todo chueco? I mean, I can't do that, right? So when that happened, I had to get a lawyer. I did not want the idea that I might one day have a grandchild, or even not a grandchild, just the idea that there would be a book out there floating about me that was wrong, that was full of lies, that outed me about political work in such a way that was frightening. I mean, it was really a violation of me. So I decided, Chicano, historian, o lo que sea, pero aquí me lo yo. So I got a lawyer, and we stopped the book project, and that's not an easy thing to do. And it's not even, it's a weird victory. You win, but what did you win? You spent a bunch of money, right, to stop something. So that's when friends began to encourage me, you write the story. If it's that great, you write it. So I began to write the stories. And the stories that I've been in Sandra Cisneros' workshop twice. She was kind enough to invite me to Macondo in Texas. And other friends encouraging me to write and pushing me to write. And finally, after spending all this money and being confronted with the violation of my family history, my personal story, I decided to write. Well, guess what? The story started coming out. Yeah, it was about Oscar and the brown buffalo and some conference I went to in 1971. Just different things that had happened. But guess what? The stories that started coming out of me were my own family stories. And that's when I began to realize that my sense of injustice, or my sense of justice, really came from my experiences in my own family, where I, as a little girl, had no power. And I come from a very traditional, male-centered family. So those senses of injustice were like huge. And I realized then, it's like, well, no wonder I can't bear to see somebody else being violated, because, you know, that little girl in me who couldn't defend herself will come out and slap you. I mean, she just, you know, and not her, not me, of course. I'm only playing two pieces, one at the beginning and one at the end. And the first piece is called The Cedar Box, which is the name of the story that I'll be reading this evening. And the last piece, these are all my own work. The first piece, The Cedar Box, I think has 5 tracks. So it's cello on top of cello on top of cello on top of cello on top of cello. It's me, all of me, but, you know, on various tracks. And really the reason isn't like, people think, oh, that's so avant-garde. I'm like, yeah, avant-garde, I didn't have money to pay my music friends to record with me. Like, I'm not going to ask them to work for free, you know. And I didn't want to do a Kickstarter, so, you know, I just thought, I'll do this. Plus, I think I really wanted to explore the cello. The cello is such a beautiful instrument. It has the range of the human voice. No como el pinche violín. Okay. Well, it's just that the violin gets the first part in the orchestra. The violins are going, dum, 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 they're flying all over. Y el cello, boom, boom, boom. So there's a part of you, the cello player is like, wait a minute, I want a melody. I want to like. So in this work, I get to explore the instrument. The entire recording is an improvisation, including what I will do for you will be an improvisation. So it's all improvised. For practical reasons as much as anything else, but as it turns out, it works out. The first piece I'm playing is the Cedar Box. Then I'll do the reading, which is in sections. And then at the end, I'll close with another piece that I wrote. It's called Viva's Lullaby. I have a dear friend whose mom passed, and the day her mother passed was the day I got the song. So I thought, oh, this is for you. So I named it after her. And so I think that's all I want to say for now, except just thank you for being present, and thank you for allowing me to do this for you. I really appreciate it, and hopefully you will walk away with something that matters, and I won't be embarrassed to see you in the morning, because this is like really a personal story. Okay? cedar. Medicine wood from the mighty cedar tree now contained Ana's ashes. It was a plain but elegant box with a strong grain. The man at the funeral parlor respectfully placed the box with the ashes in both my hands and with a slight bow from the waist. I accepted the box and was surprised by its lightness. How could such lightness contain a lifetime, children, marriages, divorce, punishment, work, resistance, and the music of Agustín Lara, Beethoven, and Chopin? And how could I have known that this would be the last time I would hold the precious funerary box in my hands for a long time to come? That her ashes would travel back and forth across borders and bumpy rides in the back of my brother's yellow Dodge van for the next 2 years, until he also left to meet her in the next world. After her death, my brother found it impossible to detach himself from Ana's earthly remains. He didn't know who he was without her. Who knew that during his turbid unraveling, while he drove that yellow van and crisscrossed the landscape of his own disorientation, he would get stopped by the infamous Policía Federal on some dark road in central Mexico, and that these cops would search the entire van, but somehow managed to miss the cedar box? What if they had found it and opened it? What would those crooked federal cops think of the white, dusty, powdered bones inside? The hustler. I recovered my mother's remains nearly 2 years later at an unexpected time and place. Following my brother's suicide, I discovered the cedar box in a dreadful dwelling high up in the hills of Otay Mesa, the back door to Tijuana, known for secret narco tunnels and danger of every sort. My brother, in his unraveling, had run away to the comfort of a whore at the border. He first met her at the Fiesta Americana Hotel while he was out cavorting with his new best friend, un disque abogado. When he walked over to ask her name, she said, Ana, our mother's name. So he took it as some sort of sign. She had come to help numb his pain. That night, they drank nearly 10 bottles of Dom Perignon at $100 a pop. Their initial contact was a whirlwind of sex, alcohol, and forgetting. The hustler was bedazzled. She had never been with a man like this one, so broken and yet so full of resources. Later, she had a child who she claimed was his. For over a year, they had traveled back and forth between Tijuana and Guadalajara looking for any money my mother might have left. And they found it with the help of the so-called lawyer. Like the hustler, the lawyer found a gold mine in my brother and used whatever connections he had to get into all of my mother's bank accounts and wipe them clean. Everyone in my family had left by then, gone to El Otro Lado, one way or another. My father and mother died one after the other through more or less natural causes, two hearts that just couldn't go on. Then there were the back-to-back suicides, my beautiful 16-year-old niece and her father, my only brother, the prince. This time of multiple and tragic deaths, one right after the other, provoked a sorrow so unspeakably deep that it paralyzed the senses and made me want to sleep, not for days and weeks, but for what turned out to be years. Still reeling from La Pelona's taking of my niece by suicide, I had now come to the border, to Tijuana, to El Otro Lado, to collect her father's remains after receiving a phone call from a complete stranger on a November afternoon. A Baptist minister in Tijuana called to say, "Me da mucha pena decirle que su hermano murió anoche." At first I could not understand the words. After months of trying to rescue him with everything I knew how to do or say, he insisted on returning to Tijuana, where he ended it all, leaving me with the burden of howling acceptance. He shot himself in a drunken game of Russian roulette at the home of an unknown stranger. But the nightmare was just beginning. On the way to the morgue, my brother had been pickpocketed by the morgue driver who picked up his body from the place where it had ended. Over $5,000 was missing from his wallet, the very last of his money. The hustler was beside herself. She knew about the money, the last of his disability payments, and now it had disappeared. Playing the role of widow, She made a huge fuss before my arrival, demanding that the local Tijuana police interrogate the driver and find that money. They did find the money, and it didn't take much for the driver to divulge his heinous crime. He admitted to robbing my brother's dead body in the hearse on the way to the morgue. Called for the purification of fire. It was what Ana herself had wanted, cremation, and the next day, Ana's ashes were placed in a cedar box. Maldición. When we arrived at Tijuana police station, I begged to see the grave thief. The sergeant looked me straight in the eyes, searching for murder. I won't touch him. I just need to see the face of the man who came to the scene of a suicide, collected the body of a tortured soul, and then stole money from his corpse like a vulture. Please, let me see him and speak with him. Just a few words. Tengo que verle la cara. The fat cop nodded in understanding. Está bien, ahora se lo traigo. A few minutes later, he brought out a surprisingly young man in handcuffs. The thief looked panicked as he shuffled towards me. Slowly, he sat across a table and refused my gaze. Are you the man who stole money from my brother's dead body after you picked him up from his terrible death? Are you? He nodded quietly, refusing to look me in the eyes in every way he could. With his head down, he offered, my wife is pregnant with our first child, as if this would explain his abomination. You are the child's father. Your child is half of you. Every single thing you do while your baby is growing inside of your wife's belly will affect your child. Do you understand me? Now, he quickly looked up, visibly shaken and shaking his head in horror from side to side. Yes, that's what you've done. You stole from my brother's dead body and from your own unborn child, who will carry the mark of your actions for all time. He began to cry as I got up and turned to the policeman. Thank you for letting me see this man's face. What would you do if he had stolen from your brother's corpse? The cop's eyes grew big and dark as he nodded with unspoken understanding. Please ask the law to do to him what he has done to my brother and to my family. I walked away. There was no forgiveness in my tongue, only the sharp edge of obsidian knives and the willingness to say the unspeakable. I, too, had become a monster. At the front desk in the police station, someone handed me a used envelope with about $3,000 in cash. The rest had already been spent by the thief. I turned around and gave all the money to the hustler. She smiled and breathed a deep sigh of relief. I didn't know whether her child was my blood or not, but it didn't really matter. My brother already had an ex-wife, a new wife, and now a hustler with my mother's name. Lost in the maze of my brother's madness, I had to make my way out. It was impossible for me to pick up all the pieces of his shattered cup. It took another 2 days to cremate my brother's body, and a third day to process the permits I would need to bring his ashes home, back into the United States, the place where we were born. Nepantla, the world between worlds. Appropriately fenced off by barbed wire, the little baby blue crematorium in Tijuana sits atop a lonely hill on the outskirts of town, where scavenging seagulls fly above the smokestacks, releasing the smoke of souls already departed into the ethers. It is an eerie place, surrounded by trash dumps, inhabited by hungry stray dogs and nothingness, just a few miles away from the streets where tourists look for cheap meals, liquor, and grotesque trinkets. I waited in the small anteroom until an attendant came out. When I gave him my brother's name, the attendant said, "Oh, this one?" as he formed the shape of a handgun with his right hand and mimed a gunshot to his mouth. I burst into tears as the heartless moron ran back into the back room to retrieve the ashes. A few seconds later, he returned and unceremoniously handed me what looked like a big tin can containing my brother's cremated remains. As I took the can, I suddenly realized that inside, the embers of his bones were still hot from the burning. "I can't carry this, it's hot, it burns. Wait here, and I'll give you a box." A few minutes later, the underpaid sadist returned with a small cardboard box that had once held Mexican chocolate, the beverage of kings. I had to return the following day to pick up the permits, without which I could not cross the border to bring home his remains. So I caught a cab and decided to stay at a local hotel that night. I would return for the permits first thing in the morning. During the ride to the hotel, all I could do to stay in my body was to hold on to that cardboard box that cradled the hot tin can filled with my brother's ashes. I looked out the window and wondered how other people could go about the business of daily life without hearing my silent internal scream. But they did. People moved about deliberately, carrying bundles or babies, and went about their lives. Some walked with great purpose, took God knows where to do God knows what, while I clutched the hot embers of my brother's life in my lap. Early the next morning, I left my brother's remains at the hotel and planned to pick them up on the way back to the border crossing after obtaining the permits. I returned to the little blue crematorium early in the morning and hoped not to see the cruel little bastard who had reenacted my brother's suicide the day before. Thankfully, he was not there. Relieved that this was the final bureaucratic step in an unending process, I walked out of the building to find one of the hustler's little sisters waiting for me outside of the crematorium with her latest cab driver boyfriend. Dice mi hermana que vengas a la casa, que hay algo que te quiere dar. Dice que es importante. Important? What could be more important than this death? We'll take you there in the cab. Oh God, back to the terrifying hills of Otay Mesa, Tijuana's back door to purgatory. When we finally arrived, I walked through the makeshift rooms comprising what was barely a house. The hustler greeted me. She was dressed up now, with makeup and earrings. She had eaten and looked satisfied. She was holding her child. I want you to take a picture of me and the baby, so you won't forget us. Is that what she wanted from me? This horrid moment memorialized in black and white? But I was in her lair, and I couldn't run away screaming or throw a fit. So I smiled and said yes, yes to the portrait of madness, and took out my camera. As soon as the photo was taken, she said, "Tu hermano aquí dejó algo en una caja de madera. Creo que son las cenizas de tu mamá." There it was. The cedar box sat on top of a desk that had once been my father's pride and joy. How many times had I seen him sitting at that light-colored wooden desk where he regularly paid bills and wrote letters. This is what the $3,000 had secured, the return of my mother's ashes and a last glimpse at my father's desk. I took the ghostly treasure chest and asked how it had arrived in this netherworld. Last I knew, we had placed a cedar box with my mother's ashes on top of her piano in her house in Guadalajara. So what was the cedar box doing here? Oh, your brother always kept the ashes in the van when he traveled back and forth between Tijuana and Guadalajara. Yo siempre iba con él, hasta me llevó a la casa de tu mamá varias veces. He took the hustler to my mother's house in Guadalajara, and he slept with her on my mother's bed and let her touch the piano and my mother's other precious things? Had he gone completely mad? None of that mattered now. The important thing was to make my way back to the border and cross the line, not only with my brother's ashes, but now I also had to cross my mother's precious human remains for which I had no permit. And how was I going to accomplish that? The cedar box was officially undocumented. It didn't matter that my mother held dual U.S.-Mexican citizenship or that she had spent her entire life teaching and working in East L.A. These ashes had gone rogue for the last 2 years, and there was no government stamp to prove that the grayish-white dust wasn't some powdered narcotic. If the border guards demanded to see what was inside, it was over. As these terrifying thoughts raced across my mind, I took the box and placed it in a red net bag, brought along for the unexpected. I said my goodbyes to the hustler and her family as I moved slowly but deliberately towards the door. Had the world lost its axis, and would this nightmare ever end? I couldn't wait to get out of there. The hustler's younger sister and the cab driver boyfriend took me down the miserable hill one last time. No more words were said. Numb and beside myself, I was filled with all the sorrows of heaven and earth as we made our way back to the hotel where the other receptacle of sadness awaited me. Now, I would have to cross La Línea twice. First, I would cross the border to take my brother's remains using the permits. I would put the tin vessel in my car parked on the U.S. side. Then, I would return to the hotel in Tijuana to pick up the cedar box and attempt to cross the inevitable border a second time, even though I wasn't sure exactly how. Fuego. Through a porthole window in the next room, I watch as they place her on a metal gurney, the conveyor belt that would slowly deliver the tiny, frail body into the mystery of a molten fire. Covered in white roses, a blessing for the next world and an apology for this one, she enters the blaze of no return. If she had been a pharaoh, I would have placed a Steinway baby grand piano next to her sarcophagus and surrounded it with her many precious books, photographs, records, and sheet music. I would have included the black and gold box of Maja soap and powder on her dresser and the pearls she often wore at the end. I would have imbued her death chariot with the echo of her beloved children's laughter and the love of her many students. But there was no temple, no grand pyramid, no epitaph, no shroud, nor incense, nor flowers, no crying nor wailing, no consideration for the fact that she was my precious mother. The year of Ana's death was unknowable and uncharted emotional territory, like childbirth. It was an event where you couldn't fathom the thing unless you had lived it and felt it in your bones and screamed it out of your own throat. 1989 took my mother away after a lifelong desire for dignity and the righteous life of a working musician and teacher, what she considered to be the highest form of art and life. Her death brought forward relentless secrets that unfolded on a road built of hard revelations that clawed and pierced their way out of this world and into the next. Las Cuatas, the twin aunties. By the time I arrived in Guadalajara from Los Angeles, the twin aunties had already made all the arrangements. Funeral parlors, burial clothes, the cheap coffin, and some religious service in a cold Protestant church where a minister had barked into a red-hot mic at the handful of us who sat before him with blank faces and churning hearts in the cavernous space called House of God. None of it seemed real, because none of it had been mine to decide. The twin tias had taken ownership of Ana's barely cold bones in some ghastly attempt to own or control what she had been in life. They wanted to possess her gifts and appropriate her talents and defiant spirit, her stunning beauty, her hands on the keyboard, her ability to live in worlds between worlds. They intended to write the last chapter, but instead they just behaved badly in the way that backward humans are capable of behaving so badly. As soon as the hijacked funeral service was over, after this terrible takeover by the twin tias, whose lives were enveloped in some sort of mysterious, boundless, bitter resentment that had no name, something came up in my gullet, like a peach pit stuck deep in the throat, something that had to be vigorously coughed up, dislodged, and spit out. "I'm going to cremate my mother's body," I announced immediately after the meaningless funeral spectacle was over. A stunned silence settled over the heartbeat choir. The bitter sisters, the gossiping lady cousins, and the tone-deaf, conniving stepfather all stood in icy silence on the stone steps of a church that wasn't mine. To exit this world and enter the next, Ana's lifeless body demanded a cleansing transformation of fire, burning into ashes what had once been the wholeness of a gifted musician with a finely tuned ear. There had been no loving washing of the body, no wrapping of the corpse in a shroud of magical text, no scent of flowers or incense, no words of love, no tribute for the dearly departed at the phony funeral. I only remember thinking that it was urgent to cover her with flowers as her body left this world. White roses, the secret incantations of the fire, and a clean slate. My mother, my source of life, had left, and I was going to see her all the way out on my own terms. I, daughter of the disinherited daughter, the one they wished they could be, was going to bring fire to purify this matter. I turned to my stunned brother. "You know this is what she wanted. It was her wish to be cremated, and I'm going to make sure her wishes are respected," I said, waiting for this first opportunity to claim my rightful place as Ana's eldest child. He said nothing and just looked away. But no one in the family has ever been cremated. Never, shrieked the oldest twin tia. Well then, this will be the first time, I fired calmly, expecting that her words would be the last words spoken about the matter. She was enraged at my audacity. God, I wanted to slap her, shake her into eternal silence until she fell like a rag doll onto the floor. But instead, I became the officious bocha snob and started making inquiries and phone calls and arrangements for the transfer of my mother's body for cremation, finding out the price of things, trying to locate those white roses that had to accompany her into the fire. How did I feel about this raw spectacle with my child at my side? It was the most eerie crossroad between panic and fearlessness. It was the instant whether you either pick up the sword or perish. There was no room for sadness in that very auspicious moment of laying my mother's body to rest. Her remains had already been violated. Sadness had to be put away for years, as it turned out. It was a place where being calm, mother, warrior came first in every possible way, because my child was witnessing the madness of our family right along with me, and there was no way to protect him from it except to hold myself together. I was fighting for my right as first child and daughter to have a say in Anna's interment. The burial decisions made by the wicked old crones had the effect and intention of ghosting me at my own mother's funeral. My son was witnessing as I became entombed in the backward practices of another century, away from the safety of our home and our world in Echo Park, a few blocks north from the lake, up Echo Park Avenue, past Vartanian's gas station, where Morton Avenue splits off to the right, a universe away from this macabre. The mean aunties were usurping the last rites in a world where the male-centered women of the family torture and erase the girl children, especially the ones whose opinions lead to right action, instead of just whipping the shit out of the universe with their tongues like the mean aunties had done all of their lives. For years after, I would attend funerals looking and yearning for a corrective experience in the rituals of other families and cultures, searching for a sense of normalcy, of how things could be different. The actions of the mean tias drove me to want to learn what other families did when the mother dies, how they dealt with the death of the loved one. Did everyone's family do these terrible things to the surviving daughter? How did other families shift about and reestablish the order of their relationships after a death? After endless phone calls and last-minute inquiries, her body was finally transported. Later that afternoon, I went directly to the crematorium located in a dusty graveyard on the outskirts of Guadalajara, accompanied by the menfolk, my mother's husband, my brother, and my young son. I insisted on time alone with her body before the immolation. I knew she was no longer in that body. Still, I needed to talk to her, look at her, touch the body that had been hers, and accept its strange, hard coldness, commune with the fact that she was no longer in it. No one could refuse me these last few moments or the urgency that I felt to release her from a body that had experienced so much surgical maiming at the hands of Western medicine, and the sadness and grief of her own family's betrayal. Clearly, this la carta, the letter. Years earlier, her family had punished her. She broke tradition and not only divorced, but then remarried. And the new husband seemed like such a pretentious pseudo-intellectual buffoon. But she had fallen in love with a buffoon. After all, he was almost a musician. He even claimed to be a chilango, but everybody knew he was really born in Mazatlan. He played a bad violin with vibrato like a spastic monkey, unable to hit a note in tune if his life depended on it. Mr. Thing's claim to fame was being an avid reader. And based on this, he had opinions about every goddamn thing there was. The fucking books and magazines were everywhere, in the house, in the car, in the garage. He read literature, science, history, art, political theory. There was Sartre and de Beauvoir, Camus, Omar Khayyam, Soviet Life, Scientific American, Mad Magazine, Siempre, Rius, Paquita, Burron, you name it, he read it or he had it. Oh, and an avid soccer fan. For a living, Mr. Thing peered at urine and blood through a microscope in a medical lab, where he always played loud classical music, much to the chagrin of his coworkers. He claimed his job was more important than the doctors because without the lab results, the doctors were just lost. Everyone at the job hated him and the pretense of his loud classical music, along with his 1959 blue Cadillac, the scandalous one with the huge fins. The letter came on the same day I had a concert at Bovard Auditorium at USC. It was summertime, and I had won a scholarship to the Congress of Strings, a national gathering of young classical string players. It was one of the highest honors I had received as a young musician, courtesy of the Musicians Union, in a preliminary attempt to break the color line in a mostly segregated white music industry. I auditioned with 2 movements of a Shostakovich cello sonata, accompanied by my brilliant pianist boyfriend, he who loved me so dearly and loved me first. I knew, as soon as it was over, that I had played well and moved the hearts of the judges. A few minutes later, they announced the winner. The Congress of Strings lasted 6 weeks and gave young musicians an opportunity to play under the baton of famous conductors and talented peers. This was the closing concert, and I was proud to be part of it, excited that my family would be in the audience. I knew how much pride and pleasure my mother took in my orchestral performances, even though Mr. Thing never once gave me a compliment. After the concert, when I saw my mother, her face looked very, very pale. She didn't say much, but I knew something had gone terribly wrong. A few days later, she showed me the letter, and then I understood. The second marriage was her greatest act of rebellion. It cost Anna a place in the family that she had once supported, and the betrayal of her family. The announcement came in a certified and notarized letter. Quote, "You are no longer deemed part of this family. You are living an immoral life, and your children are completely out of control. You are disinherited from this family. Send your children to the man who is their real father, the one who can give them guidance and prevent them from witnessing the immorality of your relationship with the one who is not their father." It was signed by her mother, her brother, and the twin sisters whose diapers she had changed, the ones she had rocked to sleep with lullabies and sent money to for so many years to make sure they had everything they needed. Shortly after the letter, Anna was diagnosed with lung cancer, the inability to breathe. I felt profoundly guilty that I might have been the cause of her disinheritance. I mean, after all, the letter referred to her out-of-control children, my brother and me, and since I'm the oldest, surely I had offended the gods. So if I was responsible for her disinheritance, then I was surely responsible for her illness too. It never occurred to me that I didn't have the power, let alone the desire, to make my mother ill. And it never occurred to me that my mother's remarriage was merely an opportunity for her younger brother to take what was hers and redistribute the inheritance and the power in the family, and that I had become the fall guy. My grandmother's favorite was her youngest son, a big-ass bully with a voice of a tree trunk and a temper you did not want to stir up. He had free rein his whole life and tormented his younger twin sisters, preferring one over the other, depending on his foul mood. When the oldest brother died, he became the man of the house, giving him an exaggerated sense of authority that was abusive and brutal. One snort short of Neanderthal, he was nevertheless his mama's hombre de la casa. It must have been easy for him to convince his adoring mother to divide the inheritance among her children before her death. He promised to care for her until the end, which he failed to do. But that's how he got the money, including the part that should have gone to my mother. He did the same thing when his older brother died. He took the widow's inheritance and impoverished his 5 nephews and nieces so he could open one more failed business. Nobody said a word. The oldest living son could do whatever he wanted. He was the king and could fuck up enormously without any repercussions. With one letter, he had orchestrated my mother's disinheritance, filled his coffers, and reaffirmed his crown. La Línea, crossing over. As I came within walking distance of the crossing point and joined the line of people going back into the U.S., I looked around and realized that everyone around me seemed pretty happy. They had no secrets. They were loud and chatting and laughing. Many were carrying bags with cheap treasures bought on impulse. Perhaps they had just eaten a good meal, had a few shots of tequila, gone shopping, spent the day loose and easy. Not me. A quick self-assessment told me that I stuck out like a sore thumb among the line of returning revelers. Dressed completely in black, my eyes had cried so much they were almost swollen shut. I was the farthest thing from a happy, carefree tourist, but I knew I had to blend in. In just a few minutes, I would face the migra crossing guard, and I had to convince him that I was just one of so many party people returning home after a cheerful day of merriment. I had to shapeshift into one more anonymous tourist in order to bring my mother's ashes back across the border where they belonged, in this endless horror story. In the line of no return, I resuscitated in myself the ability to make idle chit-chat with complete strangers. "Did you have a good time?" I asked the woman behind me. "Yes, of course she did, and she told me all about it." "Oh my God, we found this great little seafood taco place. And oh my God, the salsas were to die for. And oh my God, this afternoon I bought these cute little clay pots in the open market. Then we had a few drinks, and oh my God, we had so much fun." She happily shared her day trip to TJ as she held up her mass-produced treasures found in the mercado. As soon as we bonded sufficiently, I asked, "Would you hold my place in line while I cross the street? I need to buy a few more gifts from the vendors before we cross back." "Sure! Too bad you didn't get them at the mercado." Now, I would buy the gifts that were going to cover my sadness and shield the cedar box from overly inquisitive inspector eyes. "Thanks so much. I'll be right back." Across the street, an endless line of vendors hawked their wares. I crisscrossed the street through a snaking line of cars inching anxiously towards the border. As I reached the other side of the street, I quickly searched among the dizzying array of useless objects. Neon pink Pepto-Bismol colored piggy banks, brightly dyed Tweety bird blankets, puppets on a string, churros, paper flowers, sombreros, garapiñado candy peanuts, and God knows what else. Suddenly, I saw it. The biggest, most garish object as far as an eye could see. A monster 4-foot straw Christmas star with dozens of red and green dingle balls attached to it. Nothing else quite caught the eye like this seasonal atrocity. It was the biggest object for sale, and it was unimaginably ugly and flamboyant. The perfect distraction. I quickly paid for the 5-pointed thing and decided to add a dozen small onyx ornaments and chess pieces to my trove of valuables. With yesterday's news, the vendor double-wrapped each small piece of onyx into a bundle. I opened the red net bag and carefully placed each bundle on top of the cedar box to make it less conspicuous, and slung it carefully on my right shoulder. In my left hand, I held the monster Christmas star. The cheap dingle balls were already falling off, but I didn't care. I ran back and made it to the line well in time to walk the plank, holding my frightening treasures. The line kept moving. One at a time, the returning Americans were waved through and allowed to pass back into the promised land. As I neared my fate, I pulled out 2 IDs, a California driver's license and a federal court interpreter's badge. I figured as soon as the border cop saw the license and the federal ID badge, he just waved me through along with the rest. As we got closer, I started up the banter with my new best friend in line, chatting and giggling like an imbecile until it was my turn to face the music. As I stepped to the line and promptly pulled out my flawless identification, the stone-faced border cop looked me up and down with that look that makes you feel guilty even when you haven't done anything, let alone when you have. He quickly glanced at the monster star, but his eyes were much more interested in the contents of the red net bag. Without hesitation, he pointed and barked, "What's in the wood box?" Holy shit, he wants to know what's in the wood box. From the very air, I summoned an impossible answer. I, the smiling idiot, went into a stupid girly explanation. "Oh, it's a, whatchamacallit, it's a chess set for my dad, who's been dead for 2 years. Look at all the cute pieces." Please, God, let the first thing I open be a chess piece. "I got this on the cheap, but I had to haggle for it." Jesus, I abhor haggling with those poor vendors over a beachy dollar. Cheerfully, I began to remove and unwrap each small onyx piece very slowly and one at a time, holding each one up for him to see and simultaneously praying and begging for the miracle of lightness in this heavy moment. And it came. "Lady, don't pull out all that stuff here. Look at the line behind you. I don't have all day." He didn't have all day. Sweet Jesus in heaven, was he telling me to put the stuff back in the bag and come on through? Please, God, let it be true. "I said I don't have all day," the dog barked one last time, nodding with his head to indicate that I should move on. I quickly gathered my decoys and chirped in my most Pollyanna ass-kissy voice ever. "Thank you, officer. Have a good one." Have a good one? But the deed was done. The dead were on their way home. Ghost tree. The sun began to die as I walked away and made my way down the stairs, away from the terrifying inspection, away from the border gods who on a whim could have acted so differently and detained me and put me through certain hell, but didn't. As the smiley fakery melted from my face, I walked down the flight of stairs, deliberately trying not to move too fast, as if I had all the time in the world, even though I wanted to run. Finally, as I reached the last step at the bottom of the staircase and touched ground onto U.S. soil, there, a few feet in front of me, a small tree emerged from the barren dust. A lonely little tree, all by itself, greeted me back into the United States. Suddenly, the tree began to shake and shiver above my head as if awakened and disturbed by my presence. In a frightful shudder, hundreds of small black birds took flight from the tree's branches with one long, collective, bone-harrowing scream. The concert of screeching birds lifted into the air in formation and then dispersed into the dusk, revealing the skeleton of the little ghost tree they had invaded and then abandoned, left standing forlorn in the dirt. The November sun tired quickly and darkness descended. My legs began to shake as I walked away from the line, away from the ghost tree, away from the disturbed birds that somehow reminded me of the Hitchcock film. Each step quickly became a bigger burden because I was carrying an almost unbearable load. Somehow, I managed to cross the street headed towards the parked car. Exploding with spent fear, a distinct and increasingly urgent need to pee announced itself. The cumulative shock and sadness from days of treading between the worlds of the living and the dead suddenly settled in my kidneys, where fear resides. I had to pee now. Right this minute, now. Luckily, I had parked my car in a lot close by, facing the newly installed border fence. Water. Under the blanket of mid-autumn dusk, the high-intensity megawatt perimeter floodlights illuminated the new corrugated metal border fence where my car was parked. Appropriately constructed from the hardware remnants of the war on Iraq, the new military erection stood about 18 feet high, punctuated the top rim of the fence with tantalizing big porthole-shaped windows that zigzagged up and down the wall as far as the eye could see in either direction. When I reached the car, I quickly opened the car door and put the cedar box next to the tin can in the back seat. Exploding with urgency, I left the driver's side car door fully open. Since my car was facing the border wall, the plan was to use the open car door to block me from view so I could peek without being seen by passers-by. The fog rolled in as an act of compassion. Now, under the cover of darkness, I ripped down my pants and squatted urgently onto the ground, finally able to release the hot, steaming torrent of piss into the parched earth. The raging force of generations of silenced wrath raised a cloud of dust on the spot where the water hit the world, creating a seriously wet, expanding pea stain at the line between nations. The hazy fluorescent light beamed down onto my pale, bare ass during the precarious but inevitable public release. The pissing took forever. It went on and on like some ghoulish orgasm that took me out of my body. Finally, slowly, it ended. I stood up on trembling legs, barely able to pull myself upright, and slowly fastened my pants as I came back into my body. A great tide of relief and gratitude washed over me beyond anything I had ever felt before. Almost in slow motion, I got into the driver's seat, grateful that I had not exploded with piss in the middle of the street, grateful that I had finally rescued my family's remains, grateful that we were on our way home. I closed the blessed car door that had afforded me one less humiliation. The porthole window above me was filled with human eyes. The eyes of perhaps hundreds of faces peering into the United States from the Mexico side, peering at el otro lado. What were they doing? Had they been there the whole time? Were they waiting for darkness in order to jump the fence? Had I just peed like a frightened wild animal, ass to the wind in front of God and half of fucking Mexico? Had I just pissed out the fear and rage of my own ancestors and left a muddy mark on the dividing line between the worlds? And nobody had said a single word? Why a burst of laughter would come at a moment like this, I'll never know. As I backed the car out and away from the silent, gawking audience above me, I began to laugh almost hysterically. What else was there to do? My God, I, the shell-shocked coyote of my mother's ashes, had returned from the abyss and was bringing home the intangible victories and ruins of my family, a handful of priceless ashes in a tin can and a cedar box.
crazy about it, right? We wanted to send them the Juana Award, a magazine award, and